Got it.
Hey, everybody. I just want to introduce Mr. Charles Ray. He is a historian and a published author. He is also a veteran teacher that has experience in middle school and high school. And he's taught up to 24-year-olds in a high school setting. So it's not a traditional setting, so traditional and non-traditional. So he has a lot to bring to the table and is an expert in this time period. So with that being said, Mr. Ray, the floor is yours. And thank you again for doing this.
No worries at all, Doc. No worries at all. Anything I can do to help. Okay, guys. So today, basically, we're going to continue out. Last time I left off right about the War of 1812, kind of beginning Monroe. So, just like last time, I am dual wielding. I have two-footer tutoring up on the left side just to make sure I'm covering everything. And we'll go through this as we need to. As you pop on, or if you are listening and I speak too fast or something, please let me know. But here we go. Okay, so one of the things two-footer tutoring did want us to talk about was the first industrial revolution here in the United States. Interestingly enough, the industrial revolution doesn't start here. Of course, it starts over in England, over in Britain, during the 1760s. And interestingly enough, this kind of starts out like a spy novel, because basically the British did not want this information getting out to other people. They made it illegal for people who worked on these kinds of machines and who did this kind of stuff to leave. Somehow, this guy right here, his name is Samuel Slater, actually managed to get out, and he had memorized the plans to a machine and set up shop here in America. And he's sometimes considered the father of American industrialization. His name is Samuel Slaughter. He is one that they do want you to know for sure. He's the father of the American Industrial Revolution, the father of the American factory system. This is the guy who starts it all. Interestingly enough, it also starts out doing clothing. Who would have figured? Okay, another one they wanted to talk about was the fact that with the Industrial Revolution, we're starting to use machines now. Things are getting a little less homespun. You're starting to do different things. And one of the ones they want us to talk about is the cotton gin. 8th grade, we spend a little bit of time talking about this just because it does create the problem that the founding fathers didn't quite factor for. A lot of them did think slavery was going to go away in a few years because it was getting less and less profitable. So they didn't think too much about it. That's still an issue in the conventions and things like that. But they thought over time it would just go away for economic reasons. Well, the cotton gin is the one that put the nail in that coffin. Eli Whitney's cotton gin allows cotton to become profitable. You can do much more in a single day. Before, I think the stat was about a man could do about a pound's worth of cotton by picking the little seeds out by hand. This thing, you can do many, many more pounds than that. So it's now profitable. So the need for slave labor in the South is going to go up exponentially. Another one they want us to talk about is two big things are transportation. One of the first things to actually start this isn't the steam locomotive, but the steam locomotive is one of my favorites, so I'm starting off with it. But the steam locomotive and the railroad, you can move stuff around fast, you can move stuff around cheaper. It cuts travel times down from days to sometimes even hours, depending on the route and what was being carried. So things get transported quicker. And of course, time means money. The other big one, which should be next, is going to be the steamboat. This one is basically started out by an American named Robert Fulton. He puts a steam engine on a ship to power it up. This is a huge revolution in transportation because you can transport very heavy things against the current and against the wind, which is really big because if you've ever been out on a sailboat or you've seen like a sailing movie, if the wind is not with you, you were dead in the water. You couldn't move unless you wanted to do it by oar or by kind of poling yourself along. Now you can go upriver, you can go upriver at speed. Okay. Now, other things I want to talk about was just some different things when it came to farming. One of the big ones was the steel plow. Don't get me wrong, we're not saying that before the steel plow was created in about the 1840s by John Deere that they were using wooden ones. No, they're using iron. and it just wasn't as strong. It had a little more difficulty breaking up some of the rich soils, some of the heavier stuff, especially out west. So about the late 1830s, early 1840s, John Deere created this steel plow. It's harder. It can deal with more rock. It can plow a lot more. It's going to increase their production here, which means more food, which means cheaper prices, and more people can be supported. So there's a picture right here. This guy right here behind the ox, or I think it's the horse. I can't see my picture. Yep, still a picture. It's still a horse. The next one they want to talk about was McCormick Reaper. This Reaper right here is by Cyrus McCormick, of course. This is basically being pulled along by a horse, and it can help harvest grain much quicker than the old days where they're doing it by using a hand scythe and doing it by hand. Do a lot more. You have much larger fields, which is going to, of course, drive that price of food lower. Also allows you to have a much bigger farm, because instead of what you can clear in a couple days with just your family, you can now do a lot faster with that horse. Things are much more attainable. Okay, interestingly enough, this is one thing we don't talk too much about in 8th grade, but they do want, and according to 242, we want y'all to kind of understand, is the fact that this whole new urbanization, this industrialization, where people are moving to the cities to get jobs in factories and things like that. The use of machines to do labor is going to create a new middle class. This middle class is really beginning to emerge. A lot more quote unquote white collar jobs, such as shopkeepers, bank clerks, merchants, doctors, lawyers, teachers. There's definitely going to be it's going to be more of a middle ground between the rich and the poor. Another thing they want us to know is basically it's just driving prices down. Things are much, much more affordable for the average person. You'll be starting to get things that before were signs of luxury, such as bright colored clothes, a lot more food, candles, also like books, just various different things will become more attainable for the average person. It's not just the rich getting all the good stuff anymore. Things are getting cheaper. Okay, so moving away from industrialization and a little bit of economics, let's talk about politics. So we left off with Monroe, and really, according to 242, the only thing you need to know about Monroe is basically the Monroe Doctrine. And let's give a little bit of background. This is during the Napoleonic Wars. What's going on is basically Spain is fighting for its life against Napoleon, backed up by the British. So a lot of their colonies over here on the left, you can see the green ones right here, all the way from the Viceroyalty of New Spain, all the way down to the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata. Basically, these used to belong to Spain. Lots of money came out of here, lots of gold, silver, a lot of very expensive things that helped support the Spanish crown. Well, by 1830, most of these will become independent, including the former colonies of Portugal, with only a few left in kind of the northeastern corner of South America. This created a problem because by the time of Monroe's presidency, these things are independent, and basically a lot of the European powers have been thrown out, and they don't want them coming back in because, of course, there's always a danger they come attack us too. With all these little guys around here, we are the big dog on the block. Ooh. So basically, in one of the State of the Union addresses, Monroe issues the Monroe Doctrine, basically telling Europe that he's going to create kind of a stay away agreement with them. We promise not to mess with them. They cannot come over here. If they have colonies still, they can do that, and that's fine. But you can't come over here conquering new ones. If you do, you have to fight us. This is our territory now. So just like this little cartoon we use with the 8th graders, we have the Monroe Doctrine and the coup. What's going on is basically America is the one who is forcing stuff or running stuff over here. Another part of the Monroe Doctrine that is kind of implied, in the event something goes wrong, America is the sheriff. And like this one right here. If there's a problem, we'll handle it. This is going to be our turf now, according to the Monroe Doctrine. Early on, the Europeans don't pay a whole lot of attention to this, but later on, this will become a very huge piece of American foreign policy. Gives the Europeans a little more of a pause when it comes to dealing with the Western Hemisphere. Okay, continuing on with this, we also come into the Missouri Compromise of 1820. I'll tell you this right now, 242 breaks this thing down by kind of ideas and sections. I'm kind of doing it chronologically a little bit. So what's going on here with Missouri Compromise 1820? This is basically one of the first big compromises that's going to keep the U.S. from going to war with itself over the idea of slavery. What happens is basically they agree the whole 36-30 line, because you need to keep the balance of slave and free in the Senate. Every state gets two senators. So what goes on, they draw the line at the bottom of Missouri, which came in 1821, and say, if you're north this line, you will be a free state, free territory. If you're south this line, you're going to be slave, or at least open to slavery. And to balance out Missouri, Maine came in as a free state. Previously, it had been part of Massachusetts. And this was the first real big compromise. No one's really happy, like most compromises, but it's enough to keep everybody cool enough not to try to start shooting each other. Okay. The slavery compromise is right there. That being said, as we go in, the next thing they wanted you to know, chronologically speaking, was more about something happens under Jackson. So let's talk about Jackson a little bit. 1828, Andrew Jackson wins the presidency. He's going to portray himself as a common man because he came from the Tennessee frontier. He's a very tough man. We love to tell stories about him with the eighth graders, often things ranging from him being a judge who basically executed his own warrants, going after people, to shooting a man in cold blood. Well, not really cold blood, but shooting a man on the field of honor for calling his wife something that is unmentionable because she was divorced and married him. He took a bullet and then shot the guy between the eyes. So don't insult his wife. So yeah, very much he's for the common man, the laborer, the farmer, the frontiersman, and so much so that one of the stories goes at his inauguration, he basically invited the public to the White House, and it created quite a havoc, breaking things and doing things like that. And they had to get people out by putting a big tub of punch out in the lawn and yelling free drinks so they can get them out and close the doors. He's going to be the one who's going to. He's during his presidency and a little bit before, they're going to start doing away with the whole property requirement to vote. Before, you had to be a rich, free, usually white man. Now you just got to be a white guy. Not so much of the property qualification anymore in most places. So it's getting better. Still not the best, but we're heading in the right direction in the 1820s. He also institutes a spoils system, basically saying if you help Jackson, he'll help you get a job. So you can see here, this is a drawing from the 1830s, kind of depicting a country election. You can see it's pretty raucous affair, drinks being handed out. Some people are not exactly conscious at the moment. You see one guy in the circle, things like that. It's much more the common man. It's not any stuffed shirts around here. This is just your average everyday folk. Okay, one thing they do want you to know, according to 242, is a nullification crisis. This is probably the second time we could have had a civil war. So what goes on here is basically 1828, really to embarrass the former president, John Quincy Adams. They passed terror abominations. Basically, it angers the South because they think it's favoring the North. It's got very high duties on stuff coming from other countries, and the South loves to buy stuff from Britain because at this point in time, honestly, they were better at making stuff than the Americans were. And the South could sell them cotton and get what they wanted from England. Always fun. So when this goes on, the South basically is up in arms about this tariff of abominations. And he does not repeal it. He says, no, this has been passed. We're working on it. Deal with it for right now. And Jackson being Jackson, he doesn't take anybody's gruff by any means. So they begin to take action. The South starts making lots of noise. And interestingly enough, the vice president of Jackson, a guy named John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, basically is one of the big guys behind this. South Carolina passes the what was it exactly again? No, okay, so the they basically say they can nullify laws, they can do away with laws that don't fit them, saying if it doesn't help us, we can cancel it, we can nullify it. And basically Jackson, being Jackson, used force and threats. And basically at one White House dinner, the story goes, he's after a speech given by several people and a toast by Calhoun talking about how he prefers his state's rights, Jackson basically said, the next man that mentions succession, I will hang from the nearest tree, then sits down. So that's where you get this. Basically, when they threaten to walk out, they pass the force bill, and Jackson is by all means ready and willing to do it. And of course, the South Carolina backs down. A little bit later, they fix some tariff abominations. It brings the tariffs a lot lower. Okay, the other thing from 242 they wanted you to know was the Indian removal. Because here's one of the big things under Jackson. Jackson was not exactly a big fan of the Native Americans. What's going on is under him, they will pass the Indian Removal Act, basically removing what's called the 5 civilized tribes to Oklahoma, modern day. Basically, the U.S. promised to give them money, guns, supplies for 1 year, and escort them over. Several tribes do fight this legally, including the Cherokees. The Cherokees actually sue, and they won 2 cases. Actually, this case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and also Worcester v. Georgia, where basically the Supreme Court says the federal government's the only one who can make rules about the Native Americans. The states can't. And basically, you should be a little bit nicer to them. Jackson basically tells the Supreme Court to enforce your own rulings. So 1937, 16,000 Cherokees, as well as others, are escorted to Oklahoma. This is known as the Trail of Tears because many do die on the way west, because unfortunately it's being done during the winter. So supplies weren't exactly great, and it's a long walk. Okay, going right along with this, we'll get into Manifest Destiny. So Manifest Destiny, we're talking about this really around the time of Jackson, also a little bit further on, especially in the 1840s. Basically, Manifest Destiny is just the idea that it was given by God that Americans were going to go from coast to coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And this is where we get one of the very famous photos that we use in 8th grade. This kind of spooky specter here is supposed to be Lady Columbia, the female version of the United States. And she's heading west. She's bringing American civilization with her. This is from 1872, but it works very well for earlier as well. You see she's bringing a school book in her right hand, telegraph wire, and other American things as she slowly proceeds west. One of the things we'd also need to talk about is just territorial acquisitions. So when we left off last time, America was pretty much the United States in 1783 plus the Louisiana Purchase, which they were currently searching out and trying to figure out what all was there. They will later on add Florida because basically Spain kind of comes to the realization that eventually it will be taken by the Americans anyway, so you might as well get some cash for it. So we buy Florida from the Spanish in 1821, 1819, 1821-ish. And that will be us for many years, from 1821 through about 1845. Then, of course, if you've been doing your 242 ring, you've done your Texas history, you see the big thing right there. Texas is going to be the next big sticking spot.
I think that's certainly going to be on the test, right, Mr. Ray? The Louisiana Purchase. They always ask about that.
Yes. And Louisiana Purchase, the big thing to remember there, of course, is going to be that it doubles our size. That's the one thing they love for them to know in 8th grade. And they'll also talk about, probably Lewis and Clark, the fact that we're going out there and we're exploring it to check to make sure what we just bought. Okay. So right along, make sure I'm on. I can surprise myself. Okay. Come on now. Okay, so with Texas right there and also Oregon country up in the left-hand corner, let's move on. So moving further along with our westward expansion, let's talk about Polk. Polk comes along later. He's actually, Andrew Jackson was known as Old Hickory. This guy was known as Young Hickory. He actually was a protege of Andrew Jackson, which is very interesting. So when he wins the Democratic primary in the 1840s and then later the presidency in 1844, basically his whole platform was, we are going to basically re-annex Texas, sure, whatever, annex it at least, and also we are going to take Oregon, because at this point in time we were sharing control with the British. And if I remember correctly, one of his slogans was 44-40 or fight. Basically, he was willing to go tackle the British once again for more territory. So 1846, basically the Brits decide, okay, it's probably not worth fighting over this little Oregon territory, and we'll make a deal. I'll be honest with you, I don't remember 100% what we trade them. We do trade them a little bit. So we get control of Oregon. So make sure there's nothing here exactly they wanted you to know besides that. Florida, Oregon. Yeah. There you go. So basically, we get up to the 42nd parallel, all good jazz. Good. So let's move on to Texas. Okay, so the big thing is going to be Texas. Of course, Texas is independent from Mexico. Technically, about 1836-ish, all the way to about 1845, when they finally decide to join the U.S. They apply for annexation, and it's accepted. Of course, interestingly enough, Mexico does not want this to happen. At one point, Santa Anna did say to America that if you annex Texas, we'll consider this a declaration of war. And one of the big problems, of course, is just the border of Texas. According to Mexico, the border of Texas was the Nueces River. According to Texas, it was the Rio Grande, which you can see that whole gray area, the disputed area, is the land that is in dispute between Texas and Mexico. So it's quite a chunk of area. So what's going to happen is basically we're going to do several things. We'll try to buy it, as well as basically what becomes Mexican cession up here, the yellow area, for about $15 million. And of course, Mexico turns them down. So we basically kind of force the issue. They send soldiers into the disputed area. They're fired on. We consider this a declaration of war. About 2 years later, Mexico has been defeated. We act Mexico City, where if you have any Marine friends, this is where they get the whole from the halls of Montezuma, because they do take Mexico City, and we basically force them to accept some money, about 18 million thereabouts, and we take what we offered to buy. So we take what will become Mexican cession up in the top part right here. We established the border of Texas as the Rio Grande, and on we go. So Mexico no longer has any claims to Texas. According to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, they also have to recognize the Rio Grande. They gave it New Mexico and California. We call it Mexican cession. And we pay them 15 million, maybe 18 million, according to for tutoring. But they're about to pay them about the same amount of money we offered them in the first place. So here's the Mexican cession land. This is the land we take. This is California territory. And of course, the big thing here, 1846 to 1848 is the war. 1848, 1849 is when they discover gold in California. That's going to be a huge thing for getting us to go west. We'll get tens of billions of dollars worth of gold from California. It's going to be a huge driver for immigration to the United States. It'll bring lots of Chinese over to the gold fields here too, which will play in immigration in just a minute, as well as people from the old country who want to go that way, because everybody likes the idea of possibly striking it rich. That's going to be one of the big things about California. We'll eventually find gold there. Later on, another thing just to add is that's not all the land we buy from these guys. Later on, we come back 1853 and talk to Mexico again, saying, hey, we'd like to buy a little bit more of your land for about 10 million. And they decide to make the deal. This land is that little piece from the Gia River right here. And it basically finishes out the contiguous the continental U.S. border in the south. Okay, so let's talk about immigration. So immigration is nothing new for the United States. We are a nation of immigrants. Very few people initially come from here. Even then, you can make arguments. So what's going on here is basically, we'll talk about the three big immigration groups, including the reaction against them. So you can see here, Uncle Sam's running a hotel, many different people from many different countries. And of course, there's some that are, according to the cartoonist, creating problems. Oop, that went a little farther than I wanted to. No, it didn't. Okay. So as you can see, once again, nation immigrants. We've always had lots of immigrants. Only here recently we surpassed stuff from earlier in U.S. history, especially the little later than our period. Okay. So one of the big groups that's coming over here, including some of my ancestors, is the Irish potato famine. What's going on is basically, unlike what some people say, where basically they were only growing potatoes. No, they weren't only growing potatoes. That was just the cheapest food. They were growing other crops in Ireland, but those were being exported, so, and also taxed. But potatoes and butter and a few other things could basically feed a family and keep people alive. And when a blight, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce that fungus name because that's a little more sciencey, and I'd have to call in somebody else for that for sure. A lot of Irish do die, but many more immigrate. More than 1 million Irish came to the United States during this famine, and a lot of them settling on the East Coast. That's one of the big things, especially in cities in Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. About the 1840s on, and it's going to be a huge piece. It's going to be a lot of our labor source, especially as we start building stuff going west, things like that. You can see, not always beloved. This cartoon we show the kids every once in a while. You see basically the thing of like they're considered dangerous, they're considered different, they have too many children, like all these horrible things are being said about them. The other big group for us in 240 tutoring and high school, not high school, 8th grade U.S. is going to be the Germans. The Germans came to the U.S. for many different reasons. Some of them are because of crop failures, like the Irish. A lot of them are also because of political unrest and wars, because Germany is not Germany at this point. It's a bunch of little kingdoms, all of them beefing over territory and getting mad at each other, and every once in a while invading each other. So sometimes it's safer to move over here. They generally came to the U.S. with a little bit more money. They're also more often going out west. They'll bring things like the Conestoga wagon, the Christmas tree, kindergarten, sausage making is a big German thing, things like that. Here in Texas, we actually had a very large German population. You can see right here, the ones with green are extremely heavily populated by Germans, such as things like Bexar County, all the way through Houston. This was called the German Belt for many, many years. And we had Germans going basically all up the I-35 corridor, not too much down south though, but up in the central Texas through just kind of at the door of East Texas, lots of Germans in this area. And just like I said, hatred for immigrants is nothing new. In the 1830s, 1850s, we're running into one party in particular that pops up called the Know Nothings. They're actually called the Nativists. The Know Nothings was kind of the nickname for them because when confronted about anti-immigrant activities, they claimed to know nothing about this. No, we didn't just go beat those people up. No, that wasn't us. That's somebody else. So basically, the whole thing behind nativism, the whole thing behind nativism, is that they didn't particularly like what they were bringing over. It was basically, they said they were interfering with America's culture, doing things like that. So they wanted to limit immigration, or they want any officials in the U.S. to be native-born people and not from any other country. Okay, and then the other group that we want to talk about too is the Irish. The Irish initially coming over for the gold rush, then also were later used, also worked on the railroads, the transcontinental, especially heading from California toward the rest of the United States. They worked in mines, came things like this. Reason to get rich, usually younger men, not usually families in this case, but there were some of those especially, yes. Okay. So that's immigration. That's basically up to about 1850. 1850 comes around, we have another problem. California has grown rapidly and wants to come in to the United States as a state and not just a territory. They got another problem. It's a free area. There's the sentiment there, they want to be a free state. They do not want to be a slave state. That's going to upset the balance. Also want to be more free state than slave states. Of course, the South is not going to have that. So another compromise is hammered out by a very old Henry Clay at this point in time. He says, okay, the deal they make is California is going to be a free state. That's fine. The two territories of New Mexico and Utah can basically decide by popular sovereignty. They can do it by vote. So once they get larger and they have more people, they can decide themselves, which that's a problem for another day, basically. The slave trade was outlawed in Washington, D.C. because for many people, especially the abolitionists, they consider this kind of a stain on the national honor that we'd have people from like Britain and France, places where the slave trade was already outlawed and also like slavery in most cases, coming into the United States and seeing one of the largest slave markets in the U.S. in Washington. So they got that outlawed, but they did put teeth in the Fugitive Slave Act. For many years, there had been a Fugitive Slave Act, but it wasn't really enforced. Now it's being much more enforced. So slaves run away to the north. Slave catchers and former masters can go and get them and bring them back. So the north is getting to see it a lot more. This is going to start making them very angry. The Fugitive Slave Act, once again, required all private citizens to assist with apprehending runaways. It pretty much says the Underground Railroad is illegal. Anybody who helps can be fined for it. Anybody can also be imprisoned for it. And it's not exactly a fun thing by any means. In an 8th grade US, we show a clip from American Story of Us, which is a pretty good clip. Sorry I didn't bring it in here for time reasons, but it basically just shows a tailor who's an African-American gentleman working on a lady's dress, and the slave catcher and the local sheriff kick in the door and take him away. And basically what the narrator says is basically anybody who was African-American could be sold down the river. Didn't mean they have to be a runaway slave. All it takes was somebody to say they were. And judges were paid $10 for ruling them slave and $5 for ruling them free. So unfortunately, you probably figure out how that goes. Okay, so after the Compromise 1850, this is kind of how it stacks up. The blue states, of course, are going to be our slave states, all the way from Texas through Florida up through Virginia. Free territory is in this kind of yellowish mustard color. And then the Utah territory and New Mexico territory are much larger than the modern day states, but they will come in popular sovereignty. They can vote once they become states. That's going to be a problem for a later day. Okay, so this is going on 1850. Things are heating up. I mean, it's not a point of no return by any means. It's not a point of no return until someone starts shooting. And according to 242, the next thing they do want you to know, I don't care too much about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, really, which is interesting. But they do care about Dred Scott. One of the things they talk about with Dred Scott, and the one they want you to know is what's going on here is it kind of brings the reality of slaveholding to the nation a lot further, because basically a gentleman he's working for the U.S. Army, that his name was Dr. Sanford. He's from the South. He owns a slave named Dred Scott. And basically he's working for the Army. So he takes his slave with him, where he's living in free territory for about 4 or 5 years. They move back down south. And a few years later, Mr. Sanford dies. And Dred Scott begins a lawsuit for his freedom, saying, we lived in free territory for 4 or 5 years. I shouldn't have been held as a slave there. This was illegal. And this gets all the way to the Supreme Court. And it creates a huge problem because the Supreme Court rules he doesn't even have the right to sue. He's not a citizen. He's property, just like a horse would be, unfortunately. So when he sues for his freedom, the Supreme Court says, no, you are property just like a horse or a draft animal. And also that the U.S. government has no right to make rules regarding that. So all these compromises that have been going on are thrown out. They're declared unconstitutional in one fell swoop in 1857. So we have a problem. things that kept us from going to war are gone. There's still not a point of no return. We're not at civil war. People aren't leaving yet, but it's getting much closer. So moving right along, the next big thing to happen, according that you need to know for your guys' stuff, is going to be basically the election of Mr. Lincoln. Mr. Lincoln is elected under the Republican ticket, which is an anti-slavery party, and they run him because he's extremely moderate. He actually was not about ending slavery in the South. He would have been for it, but that was not his platform. His platform was you just can't go west with your slaves. You can keep your slaves in the South. That was fine. And when the election 1860 goes on, he wasn't even in the ballot in most of the South. He won no Southern state. He really only won the free states in the North, but he had enough electoral votes to win. One thing that helped him was the Democrats were running a broken ticket. Basically, it was split between Douglas and Breckinridge. So they had a split vote. And of course, when this happens, people get angry in the South. They didn't even see Lincoln on the ballot. They think he's going to end slavery. He's going to create problems. So things start really heating up. And eventually, South Carolina, the one here with an 8, is the first one to leave. And slowly, other southern states start following. So by the inauguration of Lincoln, he's got a serious problem on his hands. Some states are leaving. So this map is from 242 because I kind of like the way it looked. It looked kind of like a little pretty little map. You see right here, the dark blue, these are your free states, including Kansas. The tan are border states. These are states that were slave states, actually, but they stayed in the Union. You can make arguments one way or the other about how free they were in that choice. I would argue they're fairly free because there's several times when Lee invades Maryland and places like that, he does not have the amount of people flocking to his army as he thought he would. Then you, of course, have California, Oregon, and Nevada over on the West Coast. They're going to be free states. We're down south. We have Texas through Virginia that is going to be the Confederacy. And they're laying some claims to some territory, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, so let's talk about plans here. So as the states start leaving and things start heating up, we'll have our first battle at the first shots of the war at Fort Sumter, when basically South Carolina fires on a Union fort in Charleston Harbor. And that's their first shots. According to that, 8th grade history is just one of the first things the kids have to know. But as these states are leaving, the Union's starting to have to draft a plan to bring them back. So one of the big things is called Scott's Great Snake. Basically, it's the whole plan. We're going to blockade the South. And just like an anaconda, they are going to slowly strangle the South by cutting off trade with Europe. They can't get anything in. They can't get anything out. Also, they're going to use the might of the U.S. industrial North, the factories, the larger population, to basically batter the South in. They're going to slowly suffocate them from supplies, and they're going to just pummel them. The South, of course, is basically playing for time. They're hoping that Britain and France are going to come to their aid because they can't get cotton that was supplying the UK's mills or the Great Britain's cotton textile mills, things like that. That never really happens, although there were several times it almost did. Other than that, the Confederacy is banking on the fact that they know it's going to be a defensive war. They're fighting on home turf. They actually have a pretty good military leaders. They have Robert E. Lee. He's going to be a huge one. Several very high-ranking officers do go to the South. They don't want to fight against their homes, things like that. So they're pretty much banking on that. They're also banking on the fact that they believe they have more experience with guns, hunting, things like this. So that's basically the two fighters at the beginning of this war. Another thing they have going on. Okay, so we go. Am I echoing? Okay. You want me to try to log back in again, or?
Yes.